Hello and welcome to week 4 of Myths of Heroes and Villains. This week we're discussing what does hero actually mean, and we've been examining this all along. But one thing that we have a tendency to do as humans is to try to simplify our concepts into something that's easy to discuss, easy to respond to. So heroes are good and villains are bad. And what we're going to do is call into question that basic premise to see what good means, what bad means, and how does a hero and a villain actually work within the story. So for this week, we had several readings. First, of course, was from Alsford, where he is discussing what villains and monsters and masterminds do in the story and what makes them compelling and what their purpose is. Um, in my opinion, we have a fairly simplified form of villain. We often look at somebody as like the Joker here, or your Lex Luthor, or outside superhero comics. We have all kinds of villains. We have the serial killer is a famous one from the crime story where somebody has this mysterious plan to put everything together, or political thrillers has the person behind a conspiracy. We like the idea of a villain to blame for issues. For example, here's one from history: Joseph Stalin, who led Russia through World War II and was responsible for more deaths of his own people than even Hitler. The interesting thing about this role of a villain, the Stalins, the Hitlers, and everyone else we wish to blame for all of our problems, is it helps make a very complicated world into a simple form. We can turn it into a story with a good guy and a bad guy. We were good because we imposed people like this who were clearly bad. I mean, they killed their own people. They stole money, treasure, were brutal dictators, and so they're bad. But that role, that image of a Stalin or a Hitler, is no more real than this image of a Joker who could dominate the criminal underworld of a fictional city by being crazier than everybody else and somehow a little bit more clever. That isn't how the world works, and we know this. We know instinctively that when things go wrong, it's rarely the fault of one person, at least when big things go wrong. There's got to be a lot of people who will go along with that person. There has to be a systemic cultural problem that is being addressed by that person. And so when we tell stories about heroes and villains and crimes and things that are horrible to behold, we want to make it into a villain in the exact same way that in most of our religious myths, there's not only a God figure and a Messiah, but there is somebody opposing to him, an adversary. For example, even though Satan did not have a large role in the Old Testament, we still want to blame all sorts of crimes on a Satan. This individualism, this role of somebody who makes us do something or we can oppose, helps us render these complex subjects in something we can handle, deal with, talk about, teach to others, and therefore hopefully be prepared when we deal with the true complexity of the world. We also are looking at the Epic of Gilgamesh, which has been referenced several times. Some of you have talked about already. The Epic of Gilgamesh is from Sumerian myth, and it was brought down to us in clay tablets like the one you see in front of here, shattered and sometimes very difficult to read and translate. So we are missing large chunks of the myth. So sometimes if you happen to read the actual text of it, such as from the translation I linked to you, you'll see a whole bunch of missing words or words being interpreted, and that sort of thing is there because we don't actually know the story that well. However, we do know what they thought of them, how Sumerians and later generations represented Gilgamesh and what he was supposed to do. The interesting thing about Gilgamesh, especially as you watch this video, or if you happen to read any of the translations. Obviously, there's far too much to read all of it, but it's worth looking at a few of these chapters. Is that Gilgamesh is not a good guy. He is not a nice person. He does a lot of horrible things, sometimes with the help of Enkidu. Um, in his course, in his path toward being what he wants to be, being self determined, having full individualism, not be constrained by gods or destiny or even his roles keen. He wants to be himself fully realized. And this is a tempting vision. This is what we often see as villains, people who through their will and through their power and often through underhanded means break outside of anything society expects of them and do what they want. Gilgamesh, of course, learns that he has limits, that he is flawed, that he cannot be everything he wants to be, and that he does have to give in to the great equalizer, death. And so, therefore, he has to learn to be responsible because he cannot protect himself and always do whatever he wants without other consequences. But this is sometimes seen as a constraining choice. One of the problems with a character, going back to one of the first debates from this class, like Superman, is that he has all the power he wants to do whatever he wants, and yet he constrains himself within a narrow set of rules. And that constraint actually can cause more problems. He doesn't end issues as well as he could. He doesn't kill bad guys. He doesn't impose his will on others, and therefore bad things can still happen. But this is a question that goes back even further in one of the great questions of all religion and moral philosophy based on that. How can God, being all good, allow evil things to happen? Why can't it just make all good things in our world? And this is the question, the responsibility, the back and forth. Why is there evil if there is something that can be all good? And this is a question that will never be settled, but is worth discussing in our stories. That leads us to the video I had you watch, which is Jessica Jones. And Jessica Jones is a character from the comics. She was created by an author named Brian Michael Bendis, who has his fans and he has his detractors. But one thing he's best at is creating complicated characters. Jessica Jones in the comics was actually somebody who had superpowers and had a costume and liked using her powers for good and evil, and then was brought low by the villain that you will see if you watch the show even further. She refers to him a little bit in the episode you're being asked to watch. If you continue to watch the show, which I recommend, with the caveat that it can be very harrowing and have several emotional triggers for people who have dealt with various kinds of abuse, emotional or physical or sexual. But even so, if you can stand it, it is a very interesting show, very thoughtful in how it represents these real issues through the context of somebody who is physically incredibly powerful, but emotionally as fragile as anybody else. The point of the character is that she is not a nice person. She does terrible things. She manipulates people. She makes several horrible mistakes, in part because of the damage that's been done to her, but also just because she was not a generally nice person in the first place. And yet she still feels a responsibility to try to help others. She has the power, and while she can use that power to get her own way and often ignores rules or uses it to push people around and try to make them do what she wants, she also feels like that power can be used for something else and occasionally tries to do it in her flawed way. By the way, speaking of Netflix and the Marvel shows, if you have any interest in superhero fiction at all, I recommend almost all of them, such as Daredevil, Luke Cage. I admit I can't recommend the Iron Fist show, but that's not because of the character. That's because the show itself had several flaws, or the Defenders, which brings together several of these characters. And if you read my text overview for this week, you also mentioned I talk about this show, The Punisher, who is clearly not a hero. He acts out in revenge, but he is a murderer, a and does several other horrible things, including sometimes betraying or acting against people who are trying to help him. But he also is striking out against those villains that we all feel powerless against. He attacks bad guys. He takes down people who make us feel scared and alone and afraid. And he does so in a way that we sometimes, in our don't want to admit to ourselves, but sometimes really wish we could do as well. All of these shows, despite the fact that they star superpowered people, have different kinds of genres or different kinds of shows. Daredevil is sometimes a straight up superhero show with ninjas and bad guys, but it's also a crime thriller and a bit of a detective show. Luke Cage is more about an area, Harlem. It's a little bit of a cultural story that harkens back to some of the roots of the character back in the 70s, what's used to be known as black exploitation films, films that were crime thrillers with a gritty edge that starred people of color. Iron Fist is meant to be a show about kung fu action, although again this was a flawed show. Some of the moments were really good, and some of them, in my opinion, were not very good. Your opinion might be different. And Defenders is much more straight up superhero show, but also manages to bring together all these different themes. I recommend almost all these shows if you want to keep watching for your own entertainment or just to examine how these shows work. One of the things about this paper, and I noticed this in the first analytic response, is many of you did a good job being able to describe what is going on and what you were talking about. The questions you were asking were showing me how what each element in detail were. One thing I want you to push for the second paper is to also make certain your questions revolve around why. Why are you seeing these details? For example, if we're talking about Jessica Jones, why is having the main character been somebody who's gone through this abuse and is trying to fight back and sometimes failing? Why do we do that? Why is it the theme that she's trying to make certain somebody who also suffers the abuse is listened to and believed? Why is that important? We're in a moment culturally right now where these are very important issues. And so asking that question why will help you go beyond the surface analysis into the much more deep and interesting analysis of what do our stories say about who we are. Also, remember, a couple of people were not able to hit the minimum word count. I'm not a major stickler for word count, but if you are too short, it will negatively affect your grade. So try to do that. Try to be certain you can do that. And my advice in general about this is if you find yourself having trouble reaching word count, always try to see if you can add another detail or ask another question. That is the best way to expand the length of a paper. All right. If you have any questions about this or any other details, please ask me during office hours or in email. And I hope you have a good week and you had a good Thanksgiving. I will see you later.